The United States' primary objective throughout this entire war has been to prevent regional escalation. That could spin out of control very, very quickly. And I think we're willing to take a little bit of a hit politically on this in terms of pressuring the Israelis, even in the face of this kind of attack, because the risk is so much greater if Israel responds that we will completely lose control of this entire conflict.
The Israeli Defense Force has said Iran's attack on Saturday will be met with a response after the country's war cabinet held discussions earlier. An Israeli Defense Force spokesperson said, "We'll do whatever's necessary to protect the state of Israel, and we'll do it at the opportunity and the time we will choose." Iran's foreign minister has said his country's attack on Israel amounted to exercising the right of legitimate defence after its consulate in Syria was attacked, and said Iran would not hesitate to protect its interests in future. Well, in the US, Joe Biden has stressed his commitment to Israel's security, but he said he wants to prevent the conflict in the Middle East from escalating.
Iran launched an unprecedented aerial attack against Israel, and we mounted an unprecedented military effort to defend Israel. Together with our partners, we defeated that attack. The United States is committed to Israel's security. We're committed to a ceasefire that will bring the hostages home and preventing conflict from spreading beyond what it already has.
Well, that was President Biden speaking earlier this evening. Frank Lowenstein is a former US Special Envoy for Middle East Peace and a former senior advisor to the US Secretary of State. He's now Executive Director at APCO Worldwide. Good evening to you, Frank.
How are you?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you, and really good to have you with us. Israel, the Israeli Defense Force have made it very clear that they are weighing up how to respond. Do you think these calls for restraint are going to make much difference?
I do in this instance. I think that the Israelis will see the benefits of the world having been moved over to their side from what had previously been a very critical posture. And I think that they'll want to take advantage of that to the best of their ability. Also, to be clear, the Biden administration has been very explicit with the Israelis behind the scene that they do not want to see this conflict escalate. So my guess is that Israel has enough time and enough options to respond to this in a manner that they think serves their interest without escalating the war. But it remains to be seen because Bibi has some very, very extreme members of his coalition who are, I'm sure, weighing in very heavily with him right now.
Yeah, we know that the Israeli war cabinet has been meeting, has been discussing options. And as you say, there are some very hard right wing members of that cabinet who will undoubtedly be urging Benjamin Netanyahu to take some pretty tough kind of action. He's got a lot of pressure from the wider voters in Israel as well, hasn't he?
Yeah, he sure does. The Israeli public remains very, very committed to finishing the war in Gaza, and of course, the Iran issue is neuralgic for most of the Israeli public. So I do believe the Israelis will feel the need to respond in some way so that Iran doesn't get the last word here. I just think the more likely scenario is they do that in a way that doesn't result in escalation right now.
Do you think that the way that the US provided actual military support um, during this attack on Saturday means that it does now perhaps have greater sway over the Israeli leadership? Netanyahu will know that he needs to keep that US support, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it remains to be seen which BB cares more about the opinion of the United States and a lot of our regional allies and European countries who really stood shoulder to shoulder with Israel during this attack, or whether he's going to cave into the far right in his party and take some steps here that will be directly counter to our interest in preventing regional escalation. As I said, my guess is he won't, but it certainly does remain to be seen.
What do you make of the way that attack unfolded? The US had been warning about it for several days in advance. It seems as though Iran made no secret of its intentions. Do you think that the way that Iran carried out this attack, its knowledge of Israel's Iron Dome, in a sense emboldened it because it felt that it could carry out an attack like this without actually causing devastation on the ground?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think the Iranians honestly telegraphed several days in advance. I think we knew by about midweek what they were planning to do. They had told the Saudis, they had told the Emiratis and others. So I think they gave every opportunity for the U.S. and Israel and our allies to make every a successful effort to prevent the attack from actually killing anybody. And honestly, from my perspective, that was always going to be Iran's play, was to make a lot of noise but actually kill very few people, because killing people requires a response. Whereas if all the missiles and drones are blown up before they hit anything, it gives Israel the option anyway not to escalate any further. So I think the Iranians actually played this very carefully, in the sense of being, weighing their domestic need to respond with their overall desire to avoid a war with the United States. I think it was pretty carefully choreographed in advance.
And of course, we can always go backwards as to how many bits of tit for tat have been going on. But Iran does say, well, look, our consulate in Syria was attacked. A number of senior figures there were killed. And I mean, do you not think that perhaps Iran has a point when it says, look, if this had happened to the United States, if one of its embassies or consulates had been attacked, it would respond?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think implicit in the fact that the United States was obviously willing to allow Iran to launch a whole, hundreds really of missiles and drones at Israel, suggests to me that we felt like the Israelis probably had started this conflict, and we're going to have to take a hit in order to move past it. So, yeah, it's sort of a remarkable thing that the Iranians are able to launch that big of a strike directly on Israel, and our response would be to tell Israel to cool it, right? So that suggests to me that we felt like the Israelis had done something that probably warranted a response from Iran. It was just a matter of, could we contain their response so that it didn't lead to regional escalation.
And both the US and the UK now urging restraint. But I mean, is it in a sense quite surprising that they're doing so? Because does it not risk sending a signal to Iran, well, you can carry out an attack on like this, and we will simply be saying, oh yes, well, let's not get carried away in our response to this? Does it not signal to Iran that it can carry out these sorts of attacks with impunity?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what the Israelis are worried about, which is why I think that they'll find some way to respond to this, so that it isn't left to sit that they were allowed to attack Israel, that extensively without any kind of a response. That being said, the United States' primary objective throughout this entire war has been to prevent regional escalation. That could spin out of control very, very quickly, and I think we're willing to take a little bit of a hit politically on this, in terms of pressuring the Israelis, even in the face of this kind of attack, because the risk is so much greater if Israel responds, that we will completely lose control of this entire conflict.
And isn't it a fact that we've got escalation already, because we've now got an Iranian direct attack on Israeli territory?
Right. Yeah, but it's relatively contained as of right now. I think if Israel were to launch direct strikes back against Iran, that would probably provoke Iran to respond, and that's where you get into this cycle that the United States can lose control of very, very quickly. So I think that's why we're doing everything we can to tell the Israelis, and to paint this publicly as a big success for Israel, for the United States, for the Europeans who participated, and for all our allies in the region. Like, let's call this a victory and move on, I think, has been our general message.
What do you make of these suggestions that, okay, may have been a victory of sorts for Israel, because most of the missiles that were fired were intercepted, either by the Israeli Iron Dome system or by the US, the UK, or in other ways. But there has been this suggestion, hasn't there, that Iran has used that drone attack in particular to actually gather all kinds of information and intelligence about the scope of Israeli defenses.
Sure, I think that's a very valid point. But I would also point out that there's a lot of suggestions in the media anyway that the Iranian missiles, a lot of them failed before they reached Israel. A lot of them were targeted at places where they weren't going to do any damage. And the drones that they sent over there were very slow moving drones and very easy to shoot down. So I think the other way to look at this is that Iran knew exactly what it was doing in terms of making sure that they didn't kill anybody with that attack. And having succeeded in that, they think they've now sent the message they need to send, and they're prepared to move on. Just to be clear, though, if Israel were to respond with direct missile attacks on Israel, remember, Hezbollah has an arsenal of 100,000 missiles right on the border of Israel. There's no way to intercept all of those. So the notion that escalation will necessarily work against Iran isn't quite right. They have a lot of tools in their arsenal that they could use if Israel chooses to escalate the situation right now. And that's really what the United States is most concerned about.
What sort of action would you expect Israel to take then?
They've talked about cyber attacks as being one option that they could utilize to send a message without necessitating escalation by the Iranians. I think that there's a lot of other targets that they could hit in Lebanon, in Syria, that would enable them to send a message. The real red line, I think, for the United States would be a direct attack by Israel against Iran proper. I think we'll probably do everything we can to dissuade the Israelis from doing that. But short of that, I think we'll probably understand that Israel's going to take some steps here.
When you look at the situation now, before this attack, Benjamin Netanyahu was under real pressure from the international community over the way that it's been conducting the war in Gaza. A lot of calls, a lot of pressure on both the American government and the British government. People saying we should be stopping sending weapons to Israel because it's simply not complying with international law in the amount of humanitarian aid that's being allowed into Gaza. In a sense, that pressure on Netanyahu has eased, hasn't it?
Yes, exactly. And I think he probably knew it was going to, because when President Biden got really tough with the Israelis in terms of threatening to condition weapons sales, that was after the Iranian strike in Damascus. So I think Netanyahu knew that he had a few days to mollify Biden before the Iran attack, in which would result in us standing foursquare with Israel. So the real question is going forward. Does Israel take advantage of this opportunity to really reset this war, stay aligned with the United States and our allies in the region and in Europe? Or do they go back to where they were before, which is that Benjamin Netanyahu sees benefit in fighting us politically, domestically, in which case, we're going to be right back where we started from relatively soon.
I mean, there's no indication, is there, that Israel's going to, in any way, suspend the war in Gaza unless it can agree some form of ceasefire in order to get the hostages out?
Yeah, though that remains the big issue now. Where are those ceasefire negotiations? Because that was certainly the top priority of the United States as of last week. I've just read recently now that it looks like the ceasefire negotiations aren't really going anywhere. So I'm not sure what the United States plan B is. But I would also point out that Israel has effectively removed all of the IDF from Gaza Strip right now. They're doing more targeted raids, which is exactly what we had said they ought to do, several months ago. And there is some movement of Palestinian people within Gaza now, which was, again, one of the big issues in the ceasefire. So really, in my mind, the question is, has enough changed on the ground now that the emphasis on the ceasefire has been diminished? And the big question there will be how much humanitarian assistance is getting into Gaza right now. If Israel really has changed its tune on that and they're letting, 500 trucks or so a day, which is really what needs to happen, through to Gaza, then I think that might take some of the impetus off the negotiations on the ceasefire.
So that withdrawal of Israeli defense forces from Gaza, I mean, is that just tactical? Are they still planning an attack on Rafah? Or is this an effort to try to set in place the conditions for a ceasefire?
Well, I don't think it's an effort to set in place the conditions for a ceasefire, but I do think it remains to be seen whether Israel is going to do the kind of Rafah assault that they had been talking about previously. They don't have anywhere near enough soldiers, a reservist called up to actually do that right now, so it would be several weeks away at the earliest. So I think the United States will take that opportunity now to try to see if we can persuade the Israelis to move to an entirely different posture altogether with respect to the Gaza war. Again, that's where the advice of the United States can run up against Netanyahu's domestic politics and his extremist coalition partner. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
And just tell us a little bit, Frank, about what the public mood is there in the United States. Is there a general acceptance that the US, as historically Israel's strongest ally, was right to get directly involved in helping to intercept missiles on the part of Israel in order to protect Israel?
Yeah, I don't think there's any real disagreement in the United States as to whether the United States did the right thing in defending Israel against an attack from Iran. You'll find very little dissent on that particular subject. But the humanitarian issues, the civilian casualties in Gaza, all the things that got a lot of Americans really angry at Israel and really angry at President Biden, those have been pushed to the side temporarily, but they haven't gone away altogether. So that I would expect after a few days, if Israel reverts back to its prior posture with respect to humanitarian assistance civilian casualties, that you'll see the same kind of dissent rising in the United States. But there really hasn't been anything domestically other than some criticism of Biden for allowing Iran to conduct these kind of attacks. But those are really by the extreme right, so I don't think the president's too concerned about that.
And of course, the president has made it clear that US forces would not be involved in any retaliatory strikes by Israel against Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were very clear with the Iranians from the very beginning that we had nothing to do with this. I don't think the U.S. even knew until the assault was underway that Israel was going to be doing this. I don't think the White House was happy about it at all. And so, yeah, I think we've signaled pretty strongly to the Israelis that we're not going to be a part of any kind of escalatory behavior on their part. Whether that stops the Israelis or not remains to be seen.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick you up on that. You say that the US wasn't involved or wasn't aware in advance of this attack, but I mean, we've had those warnings from the US for several days that Iran was about to launch an attack.
Oh no, sorry. What I meant is they weren't aware of the Israeli attack on Damascus. That was a big surprise to the White House. We were certainly well aware of the Iranian plans days in advance, but yeah, we didn't know they were going to attack the consulate in Damascus. And I think the administration was pretty angry that Israel brought us to the brink of war with Iran with them as a result of that. So we signaled very strongly afterwards that we had nothing to do with that attack. We had no advance notice of it. We weren't a part of it, and really, as much as we could, made clear to the Iranians, hey, we don't want this to escalate any more than you do. So let's work together to keep a lid on it.
Frank Lowenstein, former US Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Really good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.